So that ends the formal proceedings of the Ordinary General Meeting. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Emerita Professor Mary O'Kane, AC, FRSN, FTSE, Honorary FIE Australian Chair, and Chair of the New South Wales, Honorary FIE Australia, and Chair of the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission. Most people know Mary as during her long reign as New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer from 2008 to 2018, a Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide from 1996 to 2001, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Adelaide from 1994 to 1996. Mary has served on many boards and committees in both public and private sectors, especially related to energy, engineering, ICT and research. She currently chairs the boards of Aurora Energy and Sydney Health Partners. Mary also carries out reviews in a wide range of fields in many countries, and recently was one of the two leaders of the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry. In 2021, earlier this year, Mary also was awarded the Royal Society of New South Wales Medal. So congratulations for that, Mary. Tonight, Mary will examine the nature of the 2019-20 bushfires, which are still very front of our mind, why they are so extreme and why they are likely to happen again. So welcome, Mary, and we look forward to a very interesting presentation.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you all for inviting me. I'll share my screen. There's an awful lot of material in the slides. So you can afford to turn the sound off if you like and just read the slides there. I've kept most of it here and I've kept very close to the inquiry for obvious sort of legal reasons, but I think there's enough material for some entertainment. The title of the talk, however, is All Mine. This was a sort of little jingle I used to sing to myself, Big Bad Fires in New South Wales. It was the start of it. And the second line, of course, which I'll remind you at the end, is they're coming again. So as Susan mentioned, last year, at the end of January last year, the Premier asked Dave Owens, the former Deputy Commissioner of Police and Head of Emergency Services in New South Wales, and me to do the bushfire inquiry. And we were given rather a tight time, so we were told we had to report at the end of July, and we did on the day. The terms of reference of the inquiry were the following: causes of the fires and the contributing factors to them, our preparation as a state and implicitly a nation for the fires, our response to the fires, but we weren't asked to do recovery. There was enough in the first three. The terms of reference did pad out some things. We were asked for comment on things such as hazard reduction, climate change, ecosystems, and so on. You can read all about it in the references I've given you. Just look up New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry and you can find the whole report. It's very long. I think it would have been a bit shorter if we'd had a bit more time, but we were racing, and so you get rather a long document, but I think it's a reasonable read, and there's a lot of colour and movement in terms of lots of wonderful pictures. I haven't tried to reproduce a lot of pictures here tonight, however. This is a slide from the inquiry report and just trying to highlight some of the big numbers. Of course, the most important number and the saddest is that we lost 26 people in the fires. We had an amazing 5.5 million hectares burnt, and as such, they're the biggest forest fires in recorded history. So quite, or more correctly, I suppose, the Australian bushfires of 2019-20 are the biggest forest fires in recorded history. Not the biggest bushfires. There are some grass fires that are bigger, but they're very big. Lost a lot of houses. On the other hand, as we point out here, a lot of houses were saved due to the great work of all the various firefighting agencies led by the RFS. And you can see some of the other figures. As well as us beavering away largely in Sydney or out on a helicopter around New South Wales, there were several other inquiries going on because there'd been fires in several other parts of Australia, as you will remember. So there was a Queensland review on, done by the Inspector General of Emergency Management up there. He was finishing almost as we started. I think he reported in the March of that year. There was a Victorian one also done by the Inspector General of Emergency Management down there that finished, I think, a week after us. Mick Kelty did the South Australian one and finished just ahead of us. And, of course, you'll remember there was the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, and that, for those of you who like governance issues, that was quite interesting. It was a Commonwealth Royal Commission, but it was also a Royal Commission of various states, including New South Wales, which complicated our lives and the lives of various people we were talking to no end as people had to manage their evidence to the various groups. In New South Wales, the Legislative Council had an inquiry into bushfire health impacts that was very useful. And also in New South Wales, the Advocate for Children and Young People was doing a special report on experience of disaster on young people. And we joined forces with the Advocate for Children and Young People to sort of ask, to help each other asking questions. There are a few more inquiries on. There was one on Kangaroo Island for South Australia, but these were the main ones going at about the same time. And in combination, they're a wonderful, and very comprehensive read of the sort of data of what goes on. You'll also find that there's one picture absolutely everyone used, and I'll share it later on tonight. Of course, we had many bushfire inquiries going in parallel with ours, but we weren't by any means the first year where there'd been bushfire inquiries. There was 100, at the time we started, we counted 114 bushfire-related reviews in 1927, and I've put a plus on there to add all the ones that have come since. And it's really interesting to note that 99 of these are since 1990. And this is a theme you'll start to see through these slides. The whole thing, as you might say, is hotting up. And we went through those, we had one of our talented secretariat went through all those reviews, all 114, and there were some very strong recurring themes. They talk about organisational structure of fire agencies and related organisations, and I'll come to talk about related organisations shortly. The bushfire response, focusing on coordination, communications, community safety, obviously is going to be a big theme. Infrastructure and assets, and again, we'll return to this. Preparedness for the bushfire, and typically the focus in most of the reports is on public land management. But we think, and we'll show you that we think this seems to be a fair bit needs to be aimed at the individual as well, and individual and family preparedness, and research and technology to varying degrees, but it's there as a thing. So what was our process? We basically saw our job as to find out what had happened and recommend what to do in the future. We tried to be as comprehensive as we could, but we say in the executive summary, and if you read nothing else of the inquiry, the executive summary is a very good read. We say we'll be a success, though, if knowledge of the bushfires goes way beyond what we found. It's a study that must keep moving, and we shouldn't just rely on the existing reports. From very early on in the review, we felt that overall, and we were getting the impression that New South Wales did not too badly at all, in fact, did rather wonderfully, and we felt it wasn't helpful to apportion blame. I should have mentioned also that, of course, the coroner was active in parallel with her, with that, and she has just been getting close to the end of that work, and so we were also stepping around the work she was doing. We called for submissions and we received just short of 2,000. We had community meetings. RFS provided us with a helicopter or various helicopters, and we actually managed to fly over many. I should have added that in. We flew over most of the fires, or over the fire grounds. Most of them were out. There were a few still going, and we managed to hold 3 meetings in the north of the state, covering 155 people, and then of course COVID hit, and we had to move to virtual meetings, and we held 13 of those amazing meetings with 612 people attending. That was quite an exercise in Zoomology as we managed that, and it was a tribute to everyone that we were able to hold them, and they worked very well. Held at about this time in the evening. We also held meetings with the responding agencies. So in New South Wales, the main agency with responsibility for bushfires is, of course, the Rural Fire Service, which is largely a volunteer organisation with some permanent staff there coordinating things. Truly excellent organisation, wonderful volunteers who gave incredibly over the 1920 season. They're very ably supported by our other agencies that are fire agency. Obviously, Fire and Rescue New South Wales, which is largely urban, but is wider than that and has a lot of expertise, particularly in things like drones, sort of a technological bent that's very laudable. National Parks and Wildlife is a fire agency and does a lot of particularly the remote work and sort of going into very hard to reach places. And people often forget that Forest Corp also is part of the fire agencies and are very good, not only at fighting fires, but they're particularly good at preparation for fires. I did put in site visits and flyovers, so we did quite a lot of looking at things. And I have to say, the very first day we flew to look over the fire beyond Queanbeyan and up over the Snowy Mountains. And it still is one of the most horrific days of my life, flying for a long, long time, seeing no living things, just burnt sticks, broken sticks over the ground. We also had meetings with the incident management teams. These teams manage, the fires are broken up by place. RFS manages all that out of the wonderful new facility, relatively new facility at Homebush. Weren't we lucky we had that, both for the fires and then for COVID? And these are generally led by someone from RFS, but sometimes from one of the other fire agencies. And they are staffed typically by people from the various fire agencies, maybe from national and international teams who are volunteering. And so we probably learned more about how the fires ran from the incident management teams than almost anything else. And then there were many agencies within the state. I'll come to the agencies in the state, but there were overseas and interstate firefighters, more of them later. We also had meetings with other government agencies. So obviously the Ministry of Health was a big part, and we'll talk about the smoke in due course. But things like spatial services, planning, obviously transport. It was pretty much the whole of the state in various ways was involved, and a lot of people gave a lot of time helping us. Then, of course, and of particular interest to me in all of this, we went around looking for fire and weather experts. And I have to say, despite the fact that many years ago I reviewed the Bureau of Meteorology and knew that was a good place to start, I just had no idea just how much expertise. Oh, well, I suppose I did have a bit of idea because I also reviewed the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC a couple of years ago. But I really didn't know how much expertise we had. And I was truly delighted to find that Australia has wonderful fire research. So many people have heard of the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. It's been going since the early 2000s. It was a government-picked CRC. It was a sort of political pick, but a very good thing to have, and a successor organisation to it. It's had 2 terms, and a successor organisation is in advanced planning by the Commonwealth at the moment. I also mentioned FRSN, which was the CRC for Spatial Information, which I chaired for many years. And it also helped a lot with remote, so its successor organisation, FRSN, helped a lot with remote sensing activities. The Bureau of Met was a vital organisation. I mentioned the ARC Centre of Excellence in Climate Extremes, which has many universities in it, but is headquartered from UNSW, and its wonderful director, Andy Pittman, acted a bit like a godfather to the inquiry, pointing us to various experts around the place, and that proved very helpful. We got a lot of help from a lot of universities, but most notably UNSW Canberra, ADFA, as some of us would call it, in the old days, the University of Sydney, Macquarie, ANU, University of Tasmania helped a lot. What do they know about New South Wales? Turns out quite a lot. And then a lot of help from CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, and the Australian Space Agency. The last two, particularly about remote sensing activities. We held 2 roundtables, one on the findings of the Bushfire Risk Management Research Hub, which I'll talk about a little bit, and the other one on Indigenous land management. And I won't talk a lot about that tonight, but that's an important part of preparations going forward. A tremendous number of people gave a lot to the inquiry, and we're very grateful to them because they were doing it, out of their own time, and often in the case of people who've been fighting the fires, totally exhausted from the summer. Of those near 2,000 submissions, here's a breakup of the numbers and the topics. Very interesting to see that hazard reduction is the absolutely number one topic with almost 700 submissions, a lot talking about climate change, about response, about communications. You'll note there's quite a few there about national parks and wildlife. And what that's largely about is there was a lot of people who were very cranky because they didn't believe national parks is a good neighbour. And we hit a lot about that. There were similarly some complaints about forestry. Obviously, there were a lot of people distressed about the wildlife and biodiversity situation where billions of animals died by estimates. It's hard to get exact estimates, but people like Professor Chris Dickman from the University of Sydney, and thank you, Kathy Bellow, for putting us on to Chris, was able to provide quite a bit of guidance in this area. And you can read some of the other things that are there. But again, we were very grateful to the time people took to write submissions, and we often followed up with individual phone calls with people who'd done that. People sent in a lot of photos too, and the State Archives are going to do a exhibition of the photos that were put forward by individuals. Obviously, they're quite startling. Now, getting into the sort of meat of the talk, when we started our consultations flying around in our helicopters, there were 4 things we heard a lot. 1, fires were largely caused by arson. 2, the problem was that fuel loads had been allowed to build up to unsafe levels. 3, the best thing to do is to stay and defend. And 4, the Fires Near Me app was a great app. Now, I'll come back to those, just vaguely remember them if you can. So what I'm going to talk about mainly from here is that first term of reference, the cause of the fires and the contributing factors. There's too much to cover everything, but I will talk to the 76 recommendations a little bit at the end. So a few facts about the bushfires. First of all, it was an incredibly long season, very unusual to go from July 2019 to the end of March 2020. So it lasted, if you like, about 67% of a year. That's a long time to have fires going. Generally, in New South Wales and in Australia more generally, the fire season moves from north to south through the season and resources follow. So you send everybody up to northern New South Wales and then or to Queensland, and then they slowly, as the season progresses, they come down through Sydney and down to the south coast. But one of the big problems of the 1920 season was that the fires continued. And I'll show you a picture in a minute which illustrates that. So there were fires still going in the north when the centre and the south started. And so this was a real challenge. And of course, there were fires in the ACT, there were fires in Queensland, Victoria, Western Australia, South Australia, so that the interstate contingents couldn't stay. They often had to go home to fight fires. Our own resources were incredibly stretched. This picture, don't try and, my eyesight can't do it, and I've got the advantage of the main slides in front of me. I'll explain. This, as you can see, is a picture of New South Wales. And the colour, the different colours show the different months when the fires happened. So up in the north, you see the sort of red colours which are denoting July, August, September, but that purple colour is the one to focus on. That's December. And you'll see there's a lot of purple still up in the north of the state as you start to see purple coming right through to the south. And many of you will remember that terrible New Year's Eve night when the south coast, of course, went up. And you can see what the state was dealing with at that point. There's loads and loads of pictures of this kind in the report. So if you like looking at pics like this, read the report. Some more statistics. This is a table of area burned, lives lost, etc., over recent fires in New South Wales. And you'll see that there have been some quite big fires, but look at 1920 by comparison. It is much bigger. It's a really gigantic fire. And so it's really very much out of the ordinary. So a few things about how these burn. This is not explaining how they're burning, but really characterising what they burn. Many of them were monster or megafires. Now, the terminology of extreme fires, well, that's sort of defined, but monster and megafires is used a bit loosely. But these large, large fires that are burning fiercely over a large area is what you tend to typically mean by a monster or a megafire. There were plenty of them. There are extreme fires too, and these tend to be the ones that connect to weather and often give rise to a large number of fire-generated thunderstorms, sometimes referred to as blow-up events, and I'll talk a bit more about them. An interesting thing about fires that we heard from almost everyone we talked to who'd been involved in fighting them is they sound as though they're describing living things. So they talk about the fires taking runs, putting out a finger, stooging around, racing through, creeping about, waking up, popping their heads up. And, you know, the RFS people are very funny indeed using this fire language. But it's very interesting, and you can see, I suppose, why there have been fire gods and things in the long distant past. They're very much something we live with. One very important aspect of the 1920 fires that seems to be at the bottom of a lot of the trouble was the fires were spreading much more quickly than expected at night, when typically the fires would self-extinguish or burn at lower intensity. A young friend of mine who's in Fire and Rescue New South Wales said to me that he went out to fire the bushfires, and many fireys did go out to volunteer, and he couldn't bear to leave fires unextinguished. But in the RFS, they often do leave a few in the bush because typically they do burn down. But this year, the 1920 year, dreadful things happened at night. For those of you who were familiar with the Cobargo fire, for example, that's a great example of something really roaring through at night, waking up somewhere in the very early hours and whizzing down to Cobargo. Another feature of the 1920 fires was the ignitions. There were so many ignitions, largely caused by lightning and embers. And there was just so much catching all over the place. Also, the fires, rather than taking a course going from sort of X to Y in some direction, were spreading in all directions, often at the same time, and doing weird things like advancing into the wind. They also ran straight over recently hazard-reduced areas that had been burnt earlier in the season, across mown grass, across sheets of water, and across bare soil with no grass. Not every fire did that, but several did, and people were stunned at just how much they the hazard reduction didn't help as much as you'd like. As many of you know, fires can and do make a scaring, roaring noise if they're big, but the descriptions we heard in the public meetings were amazing of that noise. There was massive ember spotting far ahead of fire fronts. The biggest one we could get data on was the Clear Range fire, which spotted up to 7.4 kilometres ahead. But we did hear stories of spotting going up to 20 kilometres ahead. We just weren't able to sort of get an exact measurement. And fires spotted over large bodies of water and over features that would otherwise have contained the fire. So you wondered how to get across. It spotted across. And there were lots and lots of heavy fuels like dead trees, logs being available to burn, which caused, because of embers, more fires, creating new risks. So how do we make sense of all of this? We worked with all those people I mentioned before, but we particularly asked one group to help us put a lot of this together. And that is something called the New South Wales Bushfire Risk Management Research Hub. And that is an organisation which is was set up by the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment in conjunction with several universities. It's headquartered out of the University of Wollongong. Many researchers from government, from universities and other organisations work through it. And we worked with its then director, Professor Ross Bradstock, who's a great fire expert, and the hub to formulate what were the main questions we wanted to know. And the hub carried out a series of studies and experiments and data analysis for us. And we were able to get at least some sense of what had gone on. They did a wonderful job, and you can read those publications. They're a really exciting read. And if you look up, not just that reference, just if you forget the reference, New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry, it's on the same page as the inquiry information. So what did all that analysis tell us? So here we go. The fires were large, intense, simultaneously and hard to suppress because, and here's the big reason, the available fuel was extremely dry due to the long, prolonged and widespread drought. You might say. We all knew that there was a big drought, and RFS and lots of people had been saying that something bad was due to happen. We just didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. We were very lucky the year before that it hadn't gone up, but it went in the 1920 year. Because the fuel was so dry, the abundant lightning was incredibly effective in starting new fires, and often those were in remote areas. And unless national parks and wildlife were around with their special teams, these fires could be starting all over the place, and of course they'd run together, join up, and you'd have a massive fire. As I said, lightning started most of the fires. We had bad weather through that season. Repeated extremely bad fire weather days, and the nights stayed hot with low humidity, as you'll remember. Anyone trying to sleep can probably remember that quite well. Many of the fires turned into these extreme fires with dynamic behaviours, and there was an unprecedented number of fire-generated thunderstorms, and I'll show you an interesting graph about that shortly. The ember spotting, as I mentioned, was very, very intense. And again, like all the lightning fires happening, catching all over the place, suddenly you had embers going out over areas, causing big areas of fire to start up. Because of all this and because of the stretched nature of the resources, it was very challenging often to get new ignitions out quickly. And unless you get them out quickly, they become big fires if there's a lot of fuel around. Also, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, often you couldn't detect the fires because there was so much smoke, and therefore the line scatter aircraft, which are typically used to find the fire edge and to find and assess the size of a fire, couldn't fly. And one of our problems is we don't have very precise high-resolution infrared scanning available from satellite, even though there's many, many satellites go over Australia. We do, however, have the weather satellite, Himawari, and it goes over I think it's about every 10 minutes or so, but it's very low resolution. But you can process that data to push it a lot harder than we've been pushing it. But as of 1920, we didn't have the technology finely tuned enough to be able to find out where the fire edge was with precision, and that meant it was hard to actually fight at the edge. As I said, fires got more stretched as the fires took hold up and down the state, and when the fires, because people had to go home and sleep somewhat, the fires took big runs at night, and often you came to a new day with many more fires than the day before. It was pretty scary. So the 4 ingredients for serious fire were all there, and they are spatially contiguous fuel. You had up and down the Great Divide, all that incredibly dry fuel, the dryness of the fuel and its availability to burn, so it wasn't covered or anything, it was just out there, weather conducive to fire spread, high temperatures, low humidity, gusty wind, and the ignition sources, particularly lightning. And they were all there in abundance, so off we went, up in smoke. Just a couple of comments on the fuel, because that was something where there was a lot of debate. As I said, the fuel was extremely dry and spatially contiguous, going from right across New South Wales from Queensland to Victoria. The fire-affected areas in the lead up to this fire season were much, much drier than average. We'd had a season when everyone was, as I said, expecting things to go up, and then the drought continued, and sometimes it was much drier than average. Often in parts of the state it was the driest on record. One thing, something we don't talk a lot about in the report, but it's there, is what would have happened if the big cities had gone up? What would have happened if Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong had gone up? We were probably protected by some rainfall in early spring, and probably by the fact that Fire and Rescue New South Wales has people stationed everyone, and the cities have everyone watching, and people were on alert. But we actually, in many ways, even though the fires were bad, they could have been so much worse if they had raced into the cities. And you only have to think of the sort of Lane Cove Park and things, what could happen if they get in. An interesting other blessing in the situation was that because the drought was so severe, there was very little grass fuel west of the Divide. And so there were very few grass fires. Ironically, it's when you have lots of rain that the grass grows high, and then you have frost and it kills it, and it's dry that you tend to get the grass fires, but we didn't for that year. Another thing that happened, and we studied backwards to other big fires, for example, the Black Sun Saturday fires in Victoria, that you find often that there's large-scale climate drivers contributing to the dryness. In our case, the ones that were there were a long-lived positive Indian Ocean dipole and a negative southern annular mode. And other climate drivers have been involved in some of the other fires, so they're a very good indicator of something to look at. As I said, not everyone, but lots of people told us that it was due to the high fuel loads that everything went up. Well, it wasn't quite. The fuel levels were on average no higher than they'd been for the last 2 years. They were high, but no higher on average than they'd been. It was the dryness of the fuel that did it, and therefore it was available to burn, and then there was all this lightning, so off it went. So this is the question: is should you bother hazard reducing? And of course, after everyone coughed and sputtered in the smoke last week, you should wonder. Hazard reduction is useful. It can contain fires and give you time, buy you some very crucial time in firefighting, but you can't rely on it as absolute protection. Weather was a big feature of what happened, and the fires, not only did the weather cause the fires, but the fires caused weather. They were particularly, the damaging fires were particularly driven by bad weather, and the really damaging fires are these extreme ones. So we had repeat heatwave conditions with high temperatures overnight, as I've mentioned several times. We had high solar insolation, very low humidity at day and night, hot gustily westerly winds, and all of this driving intense ember showers, and all of this drove fire-generated thunderstorms, and they spread rapidly, and they are, at the moment, impossible to suppress or contain. You'll remember there were lots of strong dry winds, and particularly you'll remember again around that new year, the stories of what they were doing in the south of the state. And as I said, a lot of this extreme fire behaviour created its own weather, and there was, as I've mentioned a couple of times, a record number of fire-generated thunderstorms. And the expert on all of this is Professor Jason Sharples from the University of New South Wales in Canberra. And Jason has been for many years studying these extreme fires, and with colleagues, particularly in the ACT RFS, and showing the links and modelling. He's an applied mathematician, and he's a firefighter too, I should mention. So he really understands it from many angles, theoretical and practical. And he's particularly looking at the links between blow-up fire behaviour and the formation of deep and widespread zones of active flaming that in turn reach high into the atmosphere and can trigger these pyrocumulus or pyrocumulus nimbus effects, the fire-generated thunderstorms. And he also talks about other fire behaviours. I'm going to talk a bit about one of them, vorticity-driven lateral spread, in a minute, that involve dynamic fire propagation, and they lead to escalation and to great danger. For those of you who enjoy going for walks in places like Switzerland, you've probably heard of the Föhn winds, or if you've read that wonderful book, Where the Wild Winds Are. And if you know anything about the Föhn wind, you'll know about the incredible fires that sometimes have struck Switzerland down the centuries that are caused by the Föhn wind and just causes these mad fires to take over. We have those winds here too, and it hadn't been recognised till relatively recently. And, for those of you interested in this, Jason's speaking to the Hunter branch of the Welsh Society on the 30th of June. That's one absolutely not to miss as a talk. This is the slide that is in all those reports. This is a pictogram of a fire-generated thunderstorm done by the bomb, trying to illustrate that you get these great plumes where the connection goes deep into the atmosphere. They cool, they form these strange-looking clouds and then cause these amazing downbursts, more lightning, more thunderstorms. What the picture doesn't have, I've always been disappointed about, is black hail. You get black hail with these sometimes too. You don't always get every aspect of it. If you know there's one around, and some people get good at spotting them, don't just go. They are very, very dangerous. A very interesting thing about the 1920 fire and fire season and these fire-generated thunderstorms was that from the time we've had satellite data available, around about 1977, 78, to now, up to the 1819 season, there'd been 60 of these fire-generated thunderstorms recorded. Sometimes they're absolutely confirmed, some were strongly suspected. And then in the 1920 year, another 30 was seen in that year. So this was an incredibly unusual year. Lots more of these fire-generated thunderstorms. Very, very scary indeed. I told you I'd mention vorticity-driven lateral spread, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I was happy to come back a bit in questions, but I'm talking about it for a couple of reasons. It's one of these cases of extreme fires, but it's also one of the few cases we can do something about it. Now, for those who like definitions, here's a definition that is a bit of a mind bender from Jason and his colleagues. It's a form of dynamic fire behaviour in which wildland fire, bushfires, spread rapidly across a steep leeward slope in the direction approximately transverse to the background winds. Got all that? It's very often accompanied by active flaming. So let's go back to the picture. So I said to Jay, I was talking to him the other day, and I said to him, was Cobargo an example of this? And it hasn't been proven yet. He's doing some work funded by RFS through this bushfire CRC on it, but he and other colleagues strongly suspect it is. But you can imagine this is Cobargo, if you like. So what happened there was that the fire was sort of mooching, stooging through the forest the night before. The Fires Near Me app said it'll be, hours before it sort of comes into Cobargo. But actually, in the early hours of the morning, it took a run and it got bigger. So you can sort of see that thing from the thing that says ignition going up the hill. Then it gets to the ridge and it spreads. This is the vorticity, or this is the lateral spread. And then it goes wild. And down the lee slope it goes, spotting away, flaming, carrying on, and causing no end of trouble. And the town of Cobargo, was off the side of the screen, getting the all of that. So why I wanted to sort of talk about this is that one thing that we explored a bit in RFS and Jason and Salar Sakari at the University of Sydney are looking at is that with cases like this, it might be possible to burn the ridges. So to find the sort of ridges these would happen on and actually keep the tops clear to stop that act of flaming. This led to me writing the minutes of a meeting with RFS one day here. And this was my little jingle, another of my jingles around the thing. Burn the ridges, fix the trails, cut defendable space, and the bushfire fails. If you could burn the ridges, you could cut down several of these extreme fires. We don't know exactly how many, but as I said, it's being investigated. Another thing I haven't talked about much, but was a real problem with the fires, and it's a lot in the report, is the bushfire trails weren't in very good condition. And often there were sort of gates with lost locks and things, or often they'd just fallen apart. And you've no idea of the number of bulldozers that had to be brought into the state to cut trails on the run. And that was another big problem. Another thing is that when we really need to move into communities that have good space around them, which doesn't have trees on it that might burn, trees and vegetation. And that's the concept of defendable space around villages, and good modern villages in the bush will have defendable space around them. And if you do things like that, hopefully you can cause the bushfire to collapse. Another thing I wanted to mention briefly, and we all thought about it, as I said, a bit last week, was bushfire smoke. So you'll remember it went on and on and on through the 1920 summer. And, you'd look out to the west and just see sort of pinky orange colours while you coughed and spluttered around Sydney, let alone the poor people who were actually, say, in the Blue Mountains or up further along the Great Divide or down south. There's evidence, and Faye Johnson at the University of Tasmania is the Australian expert in this, but there's several others who do a lot of work with Faye. There's evidence that shows that sustained exposure to poor air quality, sometimes big cities, compared to acute exposure just of days, produces greater impact. So people with prior vulnerabilities, lung problems, heart problems, diabetes and so on, it's very dangerous for them. And while we don't fully know the long-term impacts of prolonged exposure, Faye's estimate, and you'll have probably, some of you interested in this will have seen some of the data, would suggest that there probably were up to 200 people were killed by that smoke, who died or their deaths were hastened by that smoke of that season. It's something we're going to have to learn to live with, however, because we're going to have to hazard reduce. We do have these big forests. They're rapidly growing back, and it's a real question. And some of you will have heard Richard Broome from the Ministry of Health. He's a public health, a great public health physician here in New South Wales, talking about some of that in the press in the last few days. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about the 76 recommendations. You don't want to hear all of them, but there were some big themes in them. First of all, I've just touched on the fact that there are indicators of likely bad seasons, whether they are things like great droughts, very dry fuel, climate drivers and things. So we suggest that an annual statement be made to prepare everyone for what is coming. Even if it is to say it's not so bad season as expected. But above all, to tell people when there's bad season. We think there needs to be a lot of education, both for the professional firefighters, the volunteers, and those who are paid, for the public, and those in risk areas. Obviously, when you think about how much of the state burnt, there is a lot of parts of New South Wales which are highly habited at the moment, and which are actually quite dangerous to live in. So you need to know, and to know what you're doing. We need accurate warnings, and we need consistency of warning. Well, the consistency issue was fixed when all our recommendations were adopted and the other states worked in, largely fixed between states and using the same signs and things. But we still need to do a lot of work on remote sensing of data. So the data that goes into apps like Fires Near Me is accurate and can tell you where the actual fire edge is. Just on that, I should mention that at the moment, Fires Near Me is a very good app if you're at some distance from the fires. It's less good when you're up very close. And so friends of mine in Cobargo had it showing that the fire was hours away when it actually was roaring down to their farm. So another theme, a very strong theme, particularly of Chapter 2 of the inquiries, we need research on all aspects of fires, but particularly on these extreme fires and the fire-generated thunderstorms and how we should be preparing for them. We even suggest that we should become the world's experts. And just to hesitate, or not to hesitate, to stop there on the world's expert issue for a moment, one of the things we noted is that the Dutch, of course, have a country that's largely below sea level. And in the 1950s, they had some dreadful floods where a lot of people died, and they determined they were going to become the world expert in flood. And since then, I don't think they've lost anyone to flood death. Similarly, we suggest that New South Wales and Australia more generally, having had the worst forest fires in the world, should become the world experts in the research in this area and the related technologies. We also need, moving on with the themes, to understand the impact of bushfire smoke much better, as I just spoke about. We also need to develop technologies, not just technologies for remote sensing, but also technologies for firefighting. So my successor as Chief Science Engineer, Hugh Durrant-White, had developed loads and loads of wonderful robots, and many of those could be adapted, and he and his colleague Salah Sukaria have been looking at that, for example, for putting fires out or for mopping up exercises or drones. There's lots of room there, and again, we suggest that should be where New South Wales should lead. More recommendation themes. We need to get people ready for both megafires and for extreme fires and for fire weather. What are they going to do if that hits there? We need to become good at attacking fires early. That's why we need automated systems, and we need to improve our night firefighting capability. We need good administrative systems. There's lots of good systems. We heard a lot, but not everything had been implemented. Just like lots of the reviews of the past haven't been fully implemented. It's really important that the systems work particularly seamlessly under the crisis and sort of emergencies declarations that happen in these big fires. We need to be as prepared as we can be through things like hazard reduction and protection zones. We need to be good, the concept of a good neighbour with groups like national parks or forest corps, but we need to understand that that will not necessarily save us, but it will buy us some time and help a bit. And we looked quite a bit, and there's a lot to be said for supporting Indigenous land management practices, not just Indigenous burning, but our big Indigenous workshop suggested it's land management practices much more than doing it when the fire starts. That's really important. It's important, more things on the recommendation, to attend to infrastructure. So you'll have heard Minister Constance often speak about the need for the side of roads to be left clear. I've mentioned the fire trails. One of the things that people were most cranky about was losing mobile phone coverage. And so people couldn't find them, and they couldn't tell people whether they were in danger or not. So we need backup systems. There are places that are dangerous to live. People need to know. It's just like floods. We know where the fires are likely to come of various kinds, and people need to know and know what they're going to do. We need to build fire resilient communities that know when to stay and when to go and how to read the signs. We need to study our ecosystems better, if nothing else, to know what we're losing. They've probably lost so much in the way of sort of animals, plants and so on, and we don't know what's there and what's gone that we'll never know about. We also spoke a lot about appropriate gear for firefighting and for firefighters, and also the thing we hit a lot was the mental health impacts of these great big fires, and for people working, as I said, from July right through to March, the stress of that and holding down their own main job was incredible. We need to improve our evacuation arrangements, and we need to really address first responder safety so our firefighters are never in these extreme fires. So now winding up, I'm going back to those four things that we heard early on. Fires were largely caused by arson. Well, they weren't. They were actually largely sparked by lightning or embers, and they were there because the fuel was so dry. So the second thing, it wasn't that the fuel loads had been allowed to build up. Yes, they were high, but they weren't extraordinarily high. The problem really was the fuel was incredibly dry and we had loads of lightning. Stay and defend is the right approach. Well, no, it's not if you've got blow-up fires happening or likely to happen near you. Get out is the message. And that was one of the wonderful messages that came out of the Victorian Black Saturday, that actually if there's this sort of danger, the important message is get out. And of course, to do that, you need roads and you need ways to get out, and you need to know, people need to know what they're doing and how to drive through things like smoke. Fires Near Me is a great app. Well, it is, but not good if you're near the fire edge. We need to improve that. A few big messages as I finish. As I said, they were the worst forest fires in recorded history in the world. Should we be proud? Well, we couldn't help it. They, as I said right at the start, they're big bad fires, and I can assure you they're coming again. We just don't know when. The message is get out. If in doubt, get out. We, as I've said several times, need to be a lot cleverer with technologies and what we've got, so that we do have spatial technologies that could help us find the fire edge, but we need to improve our processing techniques with them, and we need to sort of put a lot of effort into really being ready. And the trouble is people tend to forget, COVID came, the floods come, but you really need to keep working at this stuff. And as I said before, it can be an opportunity. It was a horrible tragedy, but it can be an economic and social opportunity. If we had the worst fires in the world, we need to become the best in the world at dealing with them. But it's not just us. It doesn't just happen here. This is the front page or the cover of the January to March Wildfire magazine. For those of us who become fascinated by fire, it's a great, great magazine produced in the States. And they had this wonderful heading, California 2020, worst fire season ever, again, because the previous year had been worst fire season ever. It's not just California. There's global trends towards quite serious fires. So in 2018 in Sweden, indeed in many European countries. Portugal lost 62 people in 2017 and had its first documented fire-generated thunderstorm. Many of you will have heard about the wildfires in Greece when 102 people died. Australia sent a lot of help to that. South Wales sent a lot of help. Spain had wildfires in 2019 in the heat wave there, and Poland in 2020 saw some of the worst fires ever. Then you get things like Siberia in 2020 when there were fire-generated thunderstorms north of the Arctic Circle. That's quite something. South America in 2017, Chile had a very bad time. In 17 and 19, Greenland experienced large wildfires. And of course, we've all heard of California. So that's where I want to finish. And thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Mary. I'm Liz Deane, and I'm in charge of asking you the questions that people have posted. So thank you very much for that presentation. It was really exciting. I wonder if you could tell me what's actually happening now with the almost 74 recommendations that you made.
The government accepted all 76 recommendations. Like, you just have to remember the 76 trombone story.
Yes,
76 trombone story, yes. And immediately funded. We have a table in the back of the report which says which ones were needed to be done immediately and which ones needed, could be done over time. So the immediate ones were largely funded straight away, and over time the others are being addressed in various ways as we speak. But it's a very expensive undertaking, and of course the states had to deal with floods and COVID, but is definitely getting on with it. And as you know, they formed Resilience New South Wales with Shane Fitzsimmons as head. So we have a special new agency which is particularly looking at these disasters.
Great. Now, you actually gave us a lovely summary slide of all the things that were happening in many different countries across the world. Is there any international collaboration? Are the themes the same in other countries? Is there been such an analysis? What's the opportunity internationally?
That's a good question. There is a lot of research done by people like Jason and the people at the BOM and everyone. There's quite a big wildfire literature, and it is called wildfire. We say bushfire, and there's some funny things about spelling I should have mentioned too. RFS spells it as bush space fire. A lot of other people say bushfire, and the rest of the world says, the US says wildfire. There's a lot of research going on. There's a few magazines and journals. There's think tanks, for example, some of those that are not just about fire, but things like the Moore Foundation, as in Moore's Law, put a lot of money into studying it. So there are things happening. Is there enough? Probably not. We probably do need to encourage more. I think it's a wonderful area for people to do PhDs. Australia has so much data in this area, so I would encourage people who are interested in PhDs in this area to definitely think about it.
Great. Now, I've got a whole host of other questions here, so I won't just push my own questions to you, Mary. Is there any estimate of how many of the bushfires may have been caused by arson?
There is, and I don't have the numbers here with me. I was talking to the coroner the other day, but I can't remember the exact numbers. There were arson fires, but the numbers are remarkably small for what you'd think.
Okay.
By the way, RFS is very good about knowing about arson and, is watching.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the limitations of the app, which is Fires Near Me, but I'll ask you a question about that in a moment, about why. But would electric drones be able to assist in assessing fire fronts and proximity?
Yeah, I believe they would. And this is the sort of work that Hugh is an expert in. And again, I think it's a really interesting area for New South Wales because with Hugh's group and related groups, arguably we've got the best, probably the best in the world research in big robotics, Hugh's work in the automated mines and so on. So we're in a good position to push that sort of technology hard.
Okay. And so the limitations in the Fires Near Me app, what's the problem with it?
The problem is very much this issue of if there's a lot of smoke around, you can't get a line scanning aircraft up. So when you can get the line scanner up, the plane with the line scanner sensor on it, you can find the edge, and then it can be quite accurate. But you don't have the plane up all the time. So it might be accurate for a very short space of time and then won't be. If we had a hovering high-altitude drone, then we could see it at all times. And there are military ones available. Well, they're not. There's civilian ones available too. They're all called names like Raptor and Big Eagle and things. But they are expensive. And should Australia buy a couple of civilian ones is a very interesting question. Or could we use ones that had military ones partially for civilian purposes? The other thing is, can we push the Himawari data or put new sensors on new satellites? so that we've got something that's hovering and could find the fire edges at all times. That would be a great help to be able to do that. And spatial technology, satellite technology, is something where Australia is really, really good, because we, until relatively recently, hadn't had our own satellites. But the way we've contributed to the world work in this is by satellite processing. And so we need now to particularly turn to satellite processing for the purposes of bushfire. And yeah.
And is that a potential area for international collaboration?
Indeed. And it's something that I think will be pushed. People thought it was better than it was. There are technologies around developed both in Australia and other places. And when we said, well, why haven't you used these? RFS said, well, the resolution wasn't good enough. But the trouble is the people who developed them, often government agencies and things, hadn't been told at what resolution you particularly needed things. So it was an example of where you really need to have the practitioners talking very much with the scientists and the technologists. And this is why somebody like Jason Sharples is so impressive. He's a firefighter.
Right. Okay.
And he really understands both sides of it. He can model it, but he can go out there on a Saturday and, knows what it's like.
Great. Now, you mentioned that fires often went down at night, if you like. What are the specific needs of firefighting at night? What is the way to sort of...
Well, I guess we probably just need, for a start, we need resources. So typically people had a bit of a break at night and there is minimal crews on, the incident management teams keep going. But the fires can suddenly start to go, particularly in the early hours of the morning, and this is very unusual. It hadn't happened in the past. And it's one of the things that people like Jason and the Bushfire Hub and various others are starting to study. What causes them to go at night? Now, we know a little bit is low humidity, certain types of winds, but we need to be better at predicting when they will blow up at night. And at the moment, we don't know a lot about that.
So was that peculiar to this particular bushfire season, or is in fact it's been a characteristic of previous Australian bushfires?
It was particularly bad in the 1920s, far worse than normal.
Okay.
Well, normal. What's normal, of course, but generally people had thought they do die down a bit at night, or they sort of as they say, this great language, stooge around in the forest, do a little bit of burning here and there and putter around. But no, this time they often roared on.
Okay. Now, does the report actually address whether or not the fires of these latest fires were in any way related to global warming?
Yes, it does. So we talk a lot about that. It's not as simple to say that they were due to climate change. Climate change is absolutely a factor in what's going on, but there's a range of things, and they might be all climate related or to varying degrees climate related, but various things came together. I talked about those climate drivers, the incredible droughts and so on. So what causes what where is still a bit uncertain quite around the place. So it's like, you could have some countries where the temperature gets hotter and hotter and hotter and they'll never have a bushfire or wildfire. But in Australia, we seem to get these combinations that will cause it. California clearly gets it. Clearly other parts of the world are getting combos that send them off.
Right. Now, in a completely different tack, are there any recommendations in your report with respect to mental health?
Yes, there are, and particularly to provide support for mental health, particularly of firefighters, but also of families and things. And we had quite a lot of help on that from various people who had advised governments about that. And it's something that was strongly emphasised also by our own Ministry of Health. Sandy McFarlane, a former colleague of mine from the University of Adelaide, Professor of Psychiatry, is the real expert in mental health and bushfires, mental health and a lot of crises, but he's extra good in this area. Great person to give a talk at one of these sometime, Sandy, on mental health and disasters.
Great. Now, one final question to wrap up from me. You've got your 76 recommendations, which is a bit, overpowering for an individual. What can an individual do?
Particularly becoming, if you live in the forest, particularly, or know how you would get out, know how dangerous your place is, and be very well connected to the community and things to be able to know what to do. If you don't live in the forest, but say you live in Canberra, it's probably not a good idea in one of these blow-up seasons to go down to the South Coast for a holiday at New Year. So people can actually help save themselves. They can also help by not, going into the fires. And then I think it's a matter of Australia generally educating ourselves and encouraging governments to keep a real emphasis on these fires. I mean, it's easier to predict where floods will go. We can predict in general terms where the fires will be, but there's a lot more we don't know about fires than we don't know about floods at the moment.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mary. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure our very large audience did as well. And I'm now going to hand you over to Judith.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz.
My job, in fact, is to thank you. First, I'm going to thank Elizabeth Deane for a very interesting conversation. She took the questions from the audience and some of her own, but made it more conversational. And I really enjoyed that back and forth of two very good minds coming from somewhat different perspectives covering the topic. And Mary, you in particular laid such a good foundation for that conversation. I'm very glad there wasn't a quiz. Everything was extremely well explained, but you covered a lot of territory, which only a very well-informed and very organized mind of an engineer, I think, could do in such a small amount of time. But you took, I'm having an odd emotional reaction. We were very, very emotional during the fires, all of us, whatever our connection to it was, or however far away we were. And it was very hard to get a grip on it. After the droughts, we had our mind taken off, our troubles from the droughts by the bushfires. And then we had this horrible black joke of having our mind taken off the bushfires by the pandemic. And for a while we had both. And I don't know that we ever got to really think it through successfully in a very calm, rational, scientific, and organized way. I know that for me at least, and I suspect for many of our audience tonight, and those who will see it online later, you have given us that rational overview, statement of facts, bringing up problems, bringing up solutions for problems, and I think strengthening us for the next time the bushfires come and treat us so savagely. We hope it's not too soon, but I'm sure that the work you've done on your report and the way you are helping inform Australia about the results of that work are extremely valuable to us as individuals and as a community. So thank you very much for that excellent and reassuring understanding of the bushfires, reassuring us that they will come back, but that we will be better prepared and have a better understanding, a safer and sounder way forward. So Mary O'Kane, very validly a fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, very validly our Australian companion in these mighty battles. Thank you very much for giving us this summary and view into the future.
Thanks, Judith. Really appreciate it.
We really appreciated having you here this evening. And I'll close the meeting reminding everyone the first Wednesday of the month, you will always find a stimulating mathematical, scientific, engineering, or creative arts challenge for you to consider. And the next time is Wednesday, the 2nd of June. Join us then. Good night, everybody. I'll wish you good night on behalf of all of us.